Oh, hi, hello, and welcome to yet another episode of Let's Talk About Myths, baby. I hate my singing voice, and I'm barely singing. Did you think 500 episodes was enough? There will never be enough. I'm going to do this forever. I am your host, Liv, here to bring you all the most joyful and fascinating aspects of the ancient world because, gods, there's just so much to learn and so much to love and so much to fill your heart with all of the warm and fuzzies. Today, I am here with a friend of the podcast, even though this is her first episode, Dr. Melissa Funke. Melissa is one of the hosts of the Peopling the Past podcast and one of the founders of Peopling the Past, which is just generally an amazing platform full of fascinating stuff about the ancient world and specifically the real people who lived there. It's run by a bunch of amazing women who are just generally fucking lovely. They held a colloquium in Vancouver last spring, and it was so much fun and so informative and made me feel very smart and cool. And yes, a few of us did sing karaoke late one night, Melissa included. It was such a joy. But today, Melissa is here to talk all about the very real ancient woman, most famous for something that may or may not have been real, the time she flashed a courtroom of people to get herself off a charge of impiety. She was so hot, so naked, that they acquitted her. Or at least that is what her most famous anecdote says. The truth is maybe a little murkier, but no less wonderful. So today we're talking about Phryne, sometimes called Phryne, same woman. We're talking about Phryne, Hetarae in ancient Athens, sex work in the ancient world generally, who were the women of ancient Athens, pulling strings and taking gifts, and just living their best lives, or as best as is humanly possible for a woman in ancient Athens. It seems like Phryne was one of them, just living that best life. She is so cool. There was a statue of her at Delphi. A statue of a sex worker at Delphi, you guys. That is how famously hot she was. Also, this episode ended up being just truly bizarrely perfect for where we're at in the podcast right now. So Phryne was famously from Thespiae, which I forgot when I did last week's episode, aka the polis I mentioned on Tuesday, where Heracles was said to have slept with Thespius's 50 daughters. You remember that totally normal anecdote, right? And this episode revolves so much around women in ancient Athens, but including the very specific role of foreign women in Athens around the time of Phryne. Foreign meaning just not born of Athenians. And brilliantly, next week's conversation is about exactly what things were like for those foreign women. I didn't plan this. It just worked so beautifully. So we get this introduction to foreign women in Athens through Phryne, and then next week we learn about all of those women, or rather, what they could and could not do. But today, we are talking about this Phryne, this very specific foreign woman who was a badass and super cool courtesan, a hetera, before next week, all of those details with my guest, Rebecca Futo-Kennedy. We have an amazing lineup coming in. Plus, weirdly, Melissa was Ruby Blondell's PhD student, which I didn't know until we were recording. So just truly, serendipity, you guys. This whole month of episodes. Perfect. All right, no more of me rambling. Let's get to Phryne, my new favorite ancient woman. Conversations, flashing her way to freedom. Phryne and Hetarae with Melissa Funke. It's Phryne? Is that right? Or
Okay. So this is actually a bone of contention.
Great. Let's start there.
Okay, sure. I have always called her Phryne. Because of the way that people in North America tend to anglicize certain sounds in or from Greek, but Brits call her Phryne, and I suspect Australians too. And so I have had British people like be very scandalized. They're like, "Surely you mean Phryne?" And I call her Phryne. I've heard other people call her Phryne. We're not using ancient Greek here, too, right? So, like, Phryne is no more accurate than Phryne for Phryne. So,
right.
I call her Phryne, but I suspect there will be some Brits going, "Oh my God, what is she doing to this poor name?"
You know what? I mean, I prefer it that way. I swear. I mean, so many times I'll hear British people pronounce names, and it's like they're going with a Shakespearean version, and it so often sounds too much like that to me that I'm like, I kind of prefer almost the North American versions of saying a lot of the names. So I certainly do that too. I've had conversations where I'm like, we're just pronouncing it two different ways throughout, and it is what it is.
Yes. I mean, I have moments all the time where I'm like, how do I want to say this name? Do I want, like, should a kappa be a C, like a soft C in English? But I do it enough. And I tend to pick when I'm teaching what my students are most likely to hear. So
I certainly mix up, especially when it comes to the K. Like, it's very tough to decide with that one.
But it's not a living language in the same way. So if I were speaking someone's name, for example, obviously I'm not going to be like, nah, it's coming out the way I'm saying it. Obviously I would never do that to a person who is alive. I feel like Phryne can handle it if my pronunciation of her name is like the least distorted aspect of her that has made it to 2023. So
well, that leads to the perfect way, like the way I kind of wanted to start this, which is just that. So her story, I feel like, unlike most things from ancient Greece, has become like a meme that goes around fairly often of just like that one moment. I won't spoil it all, but that one moment that she seems to be so famous for. And that is all that I know about her. So I really want to hear everything, not least because she's a real ancient woman. So just, please tell me everything.
So because it's summer break, I've been kind of, spending time on social media. And I was like, okay, I'm going to just look up on TikTok. Like, what do you get for Phryne on TikTok? And you're right. She is a meme. The first thing you get is, oh, she's this woman who flashed her way to freedom, I think is one of the headlines that I've seen, but who like was naked in front of people. Right. And in a way, like that is true. Like she describing her as a meme is not incorrect. Like she's an ancient meme, basically, this woman. And so all the stories of her are just various memes that have become compiled in all of these different ways. But there is a real woman at the heart of all this. And we can't quite discover her. And that's something that you have to accept with a woman like Phryne, a figure like Phryne, because of the way her stories and details about her have been recorded, is that we're never going to like dig down to who is the real Phryne. We might as well hope to find the real Helen of Troy, right? There's no chance. But if we kind of look at the collected stories, that's where we start to get an image of what possibilities there were for a woman like her. So Phryne, the story that we are alluding to here, by the way, is the story of her trial, right? So she went on trial in 4th century Athens for impiety. And just when it seemed like she was about to be convicted, and it was possible in this kind of a case that it could have been a capital trial, right? She could have been, at risk of being put to death. And there are different stories. In one of the stories, one of the versions, she reveals herself. In the other one, the fellow who is representing her, Hyperides, basically her lawyer in the courtroom, he whips off her dress. And she's, of course, so outrageously beautiful that all the men, and of course the jury is composed of Athenian citizen men, of course, we're all sitting there, go, oh my God, she's so beautiful. And in some of the sources, they say it's almost like they're struck with religious awe, like they're looking at Aphrodite almost, right? And that this sense of this beauty, right, causes them to acquit her. So this is probably the most famous story about her of the many that are told. But the two most famous stories about her involve nudity, right? So that's the thing about Phryne. She is famously, one of the most beautiful women, or at least most attractive women, and she is periodically naked in very prominent settings in public. So the other story about Phryne that is often told, and there's only one ancient source that actually really makes this connection directly, but is that she is the model for the Aphrodite of Cnidos.
Right.
So, yeah. So, for those who aren't familiar with this statue, you've seen images of it for sure. Even if you don't know what it's called, it's known as the first monumental female nude. So the first nude female statue that is sort of life-size or bigger, right? So there's other nude images on vase paintings, on carved friezes and things, but not these statues that would be put into a temple, right? So there's this very famous statue. People will be familiar probably with the image of Botticelli's Birth of Venus, right? That pose is based on the Aphrodite of Cnidos. So the story, the one source that we have from Athenaeus, this late Roman author from Egypt, right? He says that Phryne, she was again well known in 4th century Athens. She's a sex worker. We haven't even touched on that yet, but she's a very famous exclusive sex worker. And she goes to a festival down by the sea. And it seems to be a festival down in Eleusis, which is sort of in northern Attica. And she's down by the sea and she goes and bathes in the sea. And as she emerges nude before this crowd, everyone again is kind of struck with awe. And there happen to be a couple of the most famous artists of classical Greece there. Praxiteles, the sculptor, who sculpts the Aphrodite of Cnidos, and Apelles, who is the painter who paints the Aphrodite. It's called Aphrodite Anadyomene, so rising from the sea, basically. And again, that's a very famous pose we'd be kind of familiar with, where it's a nude woman rising out of the sea. And she's, of course, I'm doing the actions for this and we're on a podcast, but she's sort of wringing out her hair on either side of her head. So it's a very famous pose. I'm going to end up talking about that pose probably later but anyways, of course, these two most famous visual artists who have probably the most impact on visual art, on sculpture, on painting in ancient Greece just happened to be there to see this famously beautiful woman emerging, right? So, so her fame is largely centered on sort of appearing naked in public at just the right time.
I mean, I love that for her. Like, what a way to leave a memory, but also especially when it comes to ancient Athens, because like we don't know a lot of real women who did things that could get them that famous, and that's fun. Yeah.
Like, who are the women whose names we know? A student once asked me this. I was teaching a class on 4th century Athens, and he was like, can you name a woman? What are the named women? And so I said Phryne. And then I said Lais. And then I just was naming all sex workers.
Right.
Which is fine. It's good. It's okay to know about sex workers. But I couldn't name just regular sort of everyday citizen women or enslaved women, certainly. And if I was an epigrapher, if I studied inscriptions, I'd probably know a few from gravestones and things like that. But in terms of the ones that I know offhand, I know a little bit about their lives. I know a little bit about their identities. That's it, right? Is mostly sex workers.
Yeah, well, I'm thinking Aspasia is the other one that I couldn't think of.
Yeah.
I don't know, like, is she 4th or 5th? But like, I mean, there's not a lot. And
she's also 5th century,
right?
But
she's also
she gets called a sex worker. She gets called a sex worker.
Okay,
she is not likely to have been a sex worker, but she's a woman in public, so why not call her a sex worker anyways?
In Athens, that's how of course, that's what they were.
I mean, there are some people who have suggested even that women like Phryne, and so the term that I would apply to her is Hetarae, which it just literally means female companion. But
I found that out, like that it just means companion, blew my mind, because the way that it is used interchangeably with sex worker all of the time.
Yeah.
And then I saw it used in relation to Patroclus, and I was like, I'm sorry, it just means companion. And like when we're translating it about men, we're saying comrade, and when we're translating about women, we're saying often straight whore. And you're like, okay, the word is the same. Really, that's what we're doing. So yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah. Well, in the way that I think that we would also use euphemisms today, if I was like, oh, I saw so-and-so and he had a companion, wink, wink, it's that kind of thing. But then you get this slippage where you can apply it to women who are in public with men, right? Who are not their husbands. And so then it's like, are they sex workers? Are they just women who are not doing what you expected or want them to do? So, and even in 4th century Athens, especially in the legal trials, right? Because quite a few of the sex workers end up on trial, right? Think about Neaira is a good example of this. And there's a very clever way that the speakers use the term Hetarae, because they're kind of suggesting, oh, companion, wink, wink, the kind of woman that you would give gifts to, wink, wink. And then, in Against Neaira, for example, the speaker towards the end, he's like, actually, she's a porne. She's just a regular old prostitute. So you see, even then, they're really aware that there is slippage in this term. So yes, you're right. Like in the modern world, we can't just assume if someone calls someone a sex worker that they are a sex worker, right? I mean, the same is true in the modern world too.
Well, and it's just so interesting to have that differentiation, because I think, like, I'm just thinking of translations, because that's what I come across most.
Yeah.
But so often you get Hetera, like when it's about a woman, translated in these like really derogatory ways, when it does just mean companion. But also, like you said, there's the differentiation between a Hetera and a porne, which is like, what, like one's like, I tend to call them like fancy sex workers on my show, like when I'm referring to that exact type, like, more like an escort versus, a more, the porn being like more traditional kind of, I guess, street style sex workers. But so often in translations, it is just like straight whore or something. And it just makes me think of, just the way things have been translated for us and how that's impacted everything. But
yes, that's a really big problem, right? Like with the Hetarae in particular, it's a huge problem. But yeah, there's a real like slippage between the terms, and definitely like we can't as scholars go, oh, okay, well you like we don't have the receipts to go, oh, well you charge by the hour, so you're a porne. Oh, did you accept a really expensive necklace? Obviously, you're a Hetarae. Like there's going to be some major slippage there, and even when it comes to like sex work, how do we determine like what actually is a sex worker? Because the Hetarae, it seems, were sometimes brought into people's houses for like long-term relationships. Is that sex work? Well, in my books, it kind of is, right? Or like there are enslaved people in houses who are basically doing sexual labor, but they're not really like, maybe they're not sex workers because that's not how they make a living. Like there's so much slippage there with sexual labor as a whole. And then the terms we use, because they're so often meant to be derogatory, it's really hard to know. And then you make a bunch of assumptions too about, again, women in public, women in the wrong place, and tickety boo, we have some misogyny there, right? Yeah.
Yeah, this comes up. I've spoken to Elodie Harper, who wrote The Wolf Den a few times, and I remember like that she was so specific in how she was talking about it, because at least in the first book, like the character is in the actual like the Wolf Den, the brothel in Pompeii, and so she made a point of using the word prostitute. She was like, she was being prostituted by somebody else. Like there's a difference there between the kind of empowerment that often can come with the term sex worker, and it especially in those cases, like the difference is important to kind of clarify, because it's just all about agency and everything. And I genuinely suspect that a woman like Phryne, who ended up becoming so famous and so prominent, her beginnings were probably not very pleasant. Again, I'm not going to guarantee anything about this, but the odds are not impossible that she was probably enslaved as a child. And we know, again, from speeches like Against Neaira, that women were brought into the sex trade enslaved very often, and often very young. Like the speaker who's talking about Neaira says she was basically too young. She wasn't mature enough when she started in sex work, right? It's dire. Yeah, if Athenians think you're too young, like then then it's really too young.
Exactly. Yeah, certainly by like 2023 standards, right?
Yeah, God.
So, it's very easy to be like, oh, she was this beautiful woman who like showed up on the seaside and was, inspired these artists. But when you really think about the power dynamics that were at play, probably for most of her life, even once she became, and I think it's very likely that she did become very wealthy at some point, there's still the way that Athenian society is set up in particular. Anyone can grab her and pop her into court. And she's got to stand there before a bunch of Athenian citizen men and hope that they're not going to put her to death or do something terrible to her. So I think it's very easy when we look at these stories of the Hetarae to get sort of swept up into the, the glamour of it. But there's like a really non-glamorous core there that we have to like keep in mind all the time. Yeah.
So if she was on trial for impiety, like, do we know what that looked like? Do we know what she did or what they said she did?
Oh, that's a great question. Okay. So one of our sources mentions that she's accused of introducing new gods, which is also the same for Socrates. It's basically the same charges that Socrates got charged with.
That's fascinating.
And I, thinking about Phryne, I was like, okay, Phryne's actually kind of, in a sense, she's like a parallel to Socrates. And so it's not uncommon to put philosophers and Hetarae together. So like the later Roman authors have a blast. They make jokes about it all the time, about how silly it is to kind of pair these two. And they always have like the Hetarae are sort of more clever than the philosophers half the time. They're getting the best of these famous men. But they're all people who are like trying to spend time with wealthy, typically younger Athenian men from elite families. And they're like making some money off of this too. Socrates less so, but they are getting something from this relationship. But again, ultimately that power still rests with those elite young men in a way, even though it doesn't seem that way. And so they're vulnerable if public opinion turns, if those men turn on them, they're in big trouble, it's not quite that the young men that were following Socrates turned on him, but enough public sentiment did, right? And there he was up on trial. And so Phryne is the same. The suggestion is that the fellow who brought her to court, a fellow named Euthias, had been her lover previously and brought her to court. And then the fellow, of course, who defends her, Hyperides, is like a famous patron of sex workers. He's apparently got like 2 or 3 on the go in different households around Attica when he steps up to defend Phryne. Again, like these all come from different sources. So I think, much of it we have to really think about a little bit more critically. But these are the stories that are told about her. So yeah, she goes up for trial for impiety, basically. She's been having gatherings in the Lyceum. And of course, the Lyceum is where Aristotle's school is, right? Like that further connection to our philosophers. She's introduced a new god. The name of the god in one of the sources is Isodites, who is like a sort of connected to Dionysus, right? So she's doing things that are making people uncomfortable, I think is the moral of that story. But the punishment in these court cases is not fixed. So what happens in first century Athens when these charges are brought, you have a sort of the main trial to see if you're guilty or not. And then you have a second sort of mini trial over what the punishment will be. So you can propose. It's the same thing that happens to Socrates, actually. If anyone's ever read Socrates' Apology, it's the exact same thing, where he gets to propose a sort of an easier punishment for himself. Anyways, and so, but the concern is that she could be put to death over this. And again, that moment of revelation is what saves her and saves her life.
Yeah. Just the idea that she was too hot for them to kill. Like, that's pretty great.
That's it right there.
But yeah, so I mean, I realized I should have started this with the note, but I will in my introduction anyway. But you've written a book on her. So that, I mean, one, that's so cool. And obviously that's why we're talking. But like, how much do we know? We know a book's worth about this woman.
Well, okay.
Like,
so
certainly.
Well, I have done, but also there's that like speculation using evidence of other similar figures where you're like, okay, there is this court case about Neaira that is one of our most fulsome sources about the life of any woman in the 4th century. Even though it's written from the perspective of someone who is obviously trying to slander her and, depict her as this horrible person, but it actually gives us a lot of insight into like what the life of a sex worker might have been like. So I'm not saying that Phryne and Neaira are the same, but they lived at the same time, right? The trial of Neaira happened in the 340s when Phryne was pretty active in Athens. So we can kind of go, okay, they were kind of peers in a way, right? They have something in common. And so whether Phryne's story is identical or just shares elements, people like Neaira and those stories give us this space to kind of speculate in a generative way. Which is what we're always doing with Phryne, because all of her stories are fragments, right? That fragments make you fill in the blanks. So anytime we encounter her. So what are the stories about Phryne? Like what do we know? Okay, we know Phryne's a nickname. It means toad because her complexion was so pale. And I'm always trying to figure out, like, what is toad like about a woman's appearance?
Especially when who's famously beautiful. Like, she's famous for being hot, but her name means toad. Like, okay, there's a lot happening.
I know.
There.
I mean, it's kind of like when you call a tall guy shorty, you know?
Right.
It's kind of like that, maybe. Yeah. But I'm not going to lie. When I was researching this book, I did look at a lot of pictures of toads just to kind of explore how that metaphor might be working. But yeah, so we know that her original name was Mene Sarete, which means like sort of recalling virtue. And she was, or excellence, I suppose. She was from Thespiae or connected to Thespiae. Thespiae is in Boeotia, which is north of Attica. So she's from Thespiae, or she has a connection. So some people have suggested her family lived in Athens as resident foreigners. And you would never be an Athenian if you're a resident foreigner. You could never, no matter how long or how many generations in the 4th century, it was impossible basically to become an Athenian. So, but I think she probably came to Athens, possibly as a refugee. Thespiae was destroyed by the Thebans, I think in 371-ish. So, you know, there's lots of ways that she could have ended up in Athens, but she definitely associated with this town, Thespiae. Okay, so, you know, what's the deal with Thespiae? Well, Thespiae is famous for its massive sanctuary to the god Eros. And what's the god? You know, Eros, the god of sexy love is how I always translate it for my students. Like desire, right? Sexual desire. So you've got the hottest sex worker of the 4th century, and she's from the same hometown as like sexy love. This is all really perfect and ideal. But I do think she really was connected. You know, if we want to say, okay, there's a real Phryne somewhere in these stories, I do think she's really connected to Thespiae. There were statues of her there historically that we know about. There's a coin that references this statue. So at some point, the statue was there. It was, of course, like a lot of famous statues taken out and moved around by the Romans. But it was there. But
a statue of a real woman, like a sex worker, ended up actually on display. That's incredible.
On display in a sanctuary. And it's a sanctuary to Eros. So, and apparently it was part of a trio. So Eros, Aphrodite, and Aphrodite, of course, who she's associated with through Praxiteles, but in this like very minor way. But yes, so Aphrodite, Praxiteles, and Eros all together in this trio. Which is great. There was also a statue of her, a gilded statue at Delphi.
Oh my God.
That was up with a Spartan king, and I want to say a famous Theban general. But, you know, and it was of her. And it wasn't like her posing as someone. It was her as herself. And so, you know, you hear there are different anecdotes where people walk in and they're, you know, they look at it and they're shocked. Who would put a statue of a sex worker in this, you know, in Delphi, right? But you know, she's prominent enough, no matter what, she's prominent enough for it to be accepted that you could find a statue of her in these places.
Yeah.
Which, you know, just says a lot about her profile. Oh, it's so cool.
Yeah.
It's so cool.
It's so cool. That just makes me so happy.
And so, like, a lot of the writers who think about Phryne, they're really obsessed with these images of her and this connection to Praxiteles. So there's lots of poems, epigrams, so the kind of poem that you would inscribe on a statue base. And often epigrams kind of blur the line between literature and object. So they'll make the object talk. If often, you know, it'll say, you know, like if it's a statue of a cow, oh, I'm the cow sculpted by Myron. You can practically hear me mooing, kind of thing, right? And so for the statues of Phryne, or statues connected to Phryne. So there are epigrams about a statue of Eros that was given to Phryne by Praxiteles. And they love to blur the lines in that relationship between like, who's the creator, who's inspiring this? Is it Eros? Is it Phryne? Is Phryne the creator of the statue because she inspired Praxiteles to create this image of Eros, right? And it's this whole, just blurring of lines. There's a very famous letter, or fictional letter, I should say, written in the 2nd century CE by a writer named Alciphron. And he's one of these writers writing in Greek under the Roman Empire. And he writes it's an invitation from Phryne to Praxiteles, to the sculptor, to come and make love to her beside the statue at Thespiae that he has sculpted of her, with the statues of Eros and Aphrodite there, like all watching on, right? And she's like, like, you gave this to me. It's a gift of your love, but from your love for me. And we're not doing anything wrong. We're not defiling anything by making love in a sanctuary. And I suspect that listeners of your podcast know that that's not usually a good thing to do, right?
No,
like,
you
you're
might
not
end
doing
up
that.
A bear or a lion.
Yeah, don't do that in like Athena's sanctuary, because you're going to end up in big trouble. But she's like, we're not defiling anything because this is like a divine love that we have. And you've created these divine images. So there's a lot of sort of melding of Phryne with Eros, Phryne with Aphrodite, blurring the lines between her and this divine sort of, it's almost like a divine trio, Phryne, Aphrodite, and Eros together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a level of irony in there that she was on trial for impiety and then this happened after the fact. Like, if anything sounds like impiety, it's like putting a human woman alongside Eros and Aphrodite as like, even just getting her that close to them in terms of importance and beauty and everything. Like,
exactly. Or like putting an image of her at Delphi, right? But I mean, if you think about, and so this is actually it's a dialogue of Plutarch's where, a cynic philosopher comes along. He's like, what the heck is this doing here? This is ridiculous. Like any good cynic, right, is, I don't like anything. But the person with him is like, well, look at everything else here at Delphi. It's all been here because of war, because of terrible things that people have done. Some of it's been stolen. And that's the impiety you're worried about. That's what you find is excessive. And I really love that moment, because it's such a great point, right? That, like, what is actually so terrible about having this noted woman when you could practically put up a temple to yourself, not quite a temple, but, you could put up a monument to yourself right inside the most sacred sanctuaries. So why can't Phryne get some action in there? Why,
Yeah.
And in the letter, literal action too, but
of course, with a reputation like hers, it's got to happen.
Yeah. So I think based on all of these connections to Praxiteles and the statues, I do think that at some point she and Praxiteles were connected. Did they have to have been lovers? I don't think so. That's not necessary, right? And that's a very common trope that you find, and it starts kind of with stories of people like Phryne and Praxiteles. That trope that obviously the artist and his model must also have an erotic connection too. They have to be in a relationship of some kind. And that's, obviously we know that that's not necessary to create art, but it's a story that like gets told and told and told and told. And when artist models become sort of popular again, especially in the 19th century, those stories, they start flying around, absolutely. People are telling those same exact kinds of stories. And often connected to images of Phryne too. It goes all the way, kind of circles all the way back around again.
So it's a very niche question, because everything you're saying makes me think of this. But did anyone ever make the connection between them and Pygmalion and Galatea?
Oh, that's a great, great question. I think that... Okay, so there's a scholar named Pat Rosenmeyer who's worked a lot on that letter of Alciphron. And she says it's like a reverse Pygmalion, where the statue comes to life and is Phryne and gets to speak, right? So Alciphron's giving voice to that. The other connection there is that the statue, the Aphrodite of Cnidos, that Praxiteles supposedly sculpts based on Phryne, there's a whole body of stories about that statue that they don't make the connection to Phryne, but there's a whole body of stories where people see the statue and they're like driven they want to make love to it. It very famously has a stain on its back, well, not on its back, on its butt, a semen stain from a young man who fell in love with it and at Cnidos, and he contrived to have himself locked into the sanctuary at night and made love to it from behind. But like, because he had fallen in love. So there's this idea that like statues can be made in certain ways by such talented artists that you can't quite tell the difference between them and a living woman. And so there's like a Pygmalion vibe. I won't say the connection is as direct, but you know, going back to those epigrams I was talking about where the statues kind of come to life, in Greek literature, there's a really strong thread of this idea of statues being not animated, if that makes any sense. Like that they're kind of alive in a way, and in the way that they affect you when you look at them, right? That they can make you do things, and it's almost like they're alive. And so I think that whole thing with Phryne kind of comes all the way back around. And I will say Alciphron, who writes that letter where she's inviting Praxiteles to make love to her, when she says, we're not going to defile anything, she uses the same verb for stain, defile, that is used often in the stories about the statue. Aphrodite of Cnidos. So I think Alciphron, like he made those connections there. So I mean, so there's all these layers, right? And they all come together in the stories about this one woman, and it's like everyone sort of wants to attach every possible thing they can to her.
It's just so much fun. I mean. Sometimes I'm just told things about the ancient world, and it just reminds me how much I love it. Because the idea that there is a famous stain on that statue makes me so happy.
Well, I think too, this is what I realized, my own personal sort of taste in like literature and film and stuff is very much like connected to the kinds of literature that preserves the stories of Phryne, because it's all these little fragments. It's like a whole compendium of fun facts about Phryne, or fun facts about so-and-so, or, you know, about classical Athens. And I'm like, you know, I really enjoy a fun fact. So
do I.
Yeah, exactly.
That's wonderful. Can you share more about the other trial, the Neaira one?
Oh, yes. Okay. So Neaira is this woman who is accused of having been a sex worker, and then passing off, or living with an Athenian man as though they're married, and passing off her daughter as an full Athenian citizen, and marrying her to a man who then takes on one of the highest political offices in Athens, which means that her daughter has to act as a priestess of Dionysus. And it's this really, like, the Athenians do not want anyone who is not Athenian. And by that, they mean Athenian mother and Athenian father taking part in these things. So it's a real scandal that they were able to infiltrate sort of that far into Athenian society. However, I have to say, we only have, as with so many court cases, we only have the one side. So we only have the speech against Neaira, right? And so if we're going to take all of this at face value, you know, they're trying very hard to make her look like a nasty sex worker. We do not want to say anything good about this woman. And like I said, they used language very carefully. They use language very carefully. They insult her by the end of the speech. They call her basically a down and dirty whore, basically. So we have to be really careful with this story. But, you know, as someone who's interested in the lives of women in antiquity, it's the most fulsome biography we have of a woman from the 4th century, right?
Yeah, so it's invaluable regardless. Like,
it
and also
is,
she sounds very cool. Like, even though they're trying to make her sound bad, like, she sounds very cool, even if she did do all that
stuff.
Well,
her life, the story that's told, again, it's meant to be insulting, but when you read it with a sympathetic eye, she's brought into sex work as a child. And she is sold, and then she becomes freed, but she's freed because she has former clients who pay for this. And she's basically stays with them and lives with them and is clearly sexually available to them. She then gets involved with other men. She travels around and I think we might even think is trafficked, right? She's moved between Corinth and Athens for different occasions. And so she's really vulnerable. And then even as this sort of speaker is telling her story, when she gets to Athens and she's living in a more long-term relationship with this fellow, there are stories he tells where they're at a banquet and she is having sex with everyone there and is getting drunk. And then some of the enslaved people in the household come and have sex with her. And so it's supposed to be insulting about her. But when you really think about the vulnerability of an actual person in a circumstance like that, whether it's true or not, it's plausible.
Mm-hmm.
And just that is actually really like deeply saddening. And
Mm-hmm.
so, you know, the more you read this speech, the more you just think about, oh my goodness, if this is telling the story of a real woman and these things really happened to that real individual, it's horrific, actually, right? Like she was abused and taken advantage of. So I think when we think about the Hetarae, we get so sort of carried away with the artist's model and the this and the that the vulnerabilities of women like this, even if they had become wealthy, are still really serious and really intense. Yeah.
Well, and I think it almost like it just makes it more kind of empowering that she did succeed in like getting herself that power and passing herself off as an Athenian and her daughter and everything. Like it just feels like, you know, I mean, way to go after a life like that and being able to do that. It just, I mean, I know the Athenians would have been mad, but like, I think it sounds
well,
like
I mean, part of me is like, well, don't set up this horrible misogynist society if you don't want someone to come in and turn it on its head, right?
Exactly. Like it's Athens. Like they were, I mean, the women often did not have it great. And so if she was able to like make it pretty good for her by Athenian standards, like, yeah, I mean, it just feels like more power to her because, they were not setting anyone up for success.
Yeah. Well, make it as good as you can for yourself in these really nasty scenarios. And so that's kind of what I think. And again, these are very rare stories of women, I think, being able to live these lifestyles. There would have been like a handful, I imagine. But, you know, this idea that, you know, you have these strictures that you're forced to operate within, right? But here you are maybe doing things that are unexpected or, you know, and I want to be careful when I talk about this because I don't want to be one of those people who's like, well, obviously all the rest of those enslaved sex workers weren't, you know, working hard enough or whatever. I don't want to ever sort of give that impression, right? That sort of neoliberal, oh, they should have pulled themselves up by their bootstraps.
I do not think any of my listeners would think that. I would certainly.
Okay, good. Okay, I want to be really careful there about that, though.
God.
But you know, a woman like Phryne, you know, the fact that she was able to be so sort of compelling and of such ongoing interest to people, you know, it also, I think, speaks to people's discomfort or discomfort is the right word. Their discomfort with kind of that misogynistic system that's set up to ultimately kind of control women. Even within that system, people were super compelled by people like Phryne. They're showing up on comic stages, their characters, their punchlines, you know, they were trying to digest the role of a woman like Phryne in a society like that didn't really have a role for her. And she was creating her own, basically. Yeah.
It makes me think, like, I obviously, I often wonder about this, and I don't know anyone who reasonably couldn't, but just like the things that women must have talked about amongst themselves that we don't know, you know, and like, right? Like, especially when it comes to someone like this, like, I just want to know what the Athenian women, well, you know, I don't mean technical Athenian women, I mean women in Athens, you know, what were they thinking and talking to each other about when this was all going on? And I just want to imagine.
Okay, so I've mentioned him already. One of my favorite authors from the ancient world is this fellow Alciphron, writing in kind of roughly the 2nd century CE, kind of end of the 2nd century. He's one of those authors writing in Greek about classical Athens under the Roman Empire, right? He's recreating it. And he is, to me, the Wes Anderson of the ancient world. Because he recreates this world in such detail, but you know, you've seen a Wes Anderson movie. You're like, oh yeah, there's the Grand Budapest Hotel. It's set in pre-war Europe. How do I know that? Well, I can. Oh, if I really look closely at the details, they've actually been kind of invented by Wes Anderson. So you're forced to kind of look at his artistry while you're enjoying this nostalgic image. So that's what Alciphron does. He writes fictional letters, and he has 4 books of them. And the 4th book is called Letters of Hetarae. It is letters written by the Hetarae of Athens. So some of them are the famous ones like Phryne, to each other about sort of their daily lives and what's going on. So there's the letter from Phryne to Praxiteles. There's a couple letters about the court case, right, of Phryne. But it's sort of this speculative way to think about, like, what would these women have said to each other? What might they have talked about, right? What are they interested in? And so it's this attempt, obviously by a male author, but to kind of harness these women's voices and to think about, how are these women thinking about their own lives? And that's why I love it, because of course we're in this space where we have next to no words by women themselves, right? But these are like at least purporting to be the words of these women. So yeah, if I could find like a real letter written by Phryne to one of her pals, that's like, oh my God, a document I would give anything for.
Yeah. That makes me think, and I've not read enough of this to know kind of how it comes across, but it makes me think of Lucian, because I recently kind of did some more digging into him, and I know he wrote a lot of like dialogues like that. Yeah, I've still only read The True History, which is a piece of art. But yeah, now I'm interested in all the dialogues that he wrote too, mostly because of how much I love The True History.
Yeah. No, I mean, Lucian, he writes so many different kinds of things, and they're all, and it's kind of similar to what Alciphron is doing. It's stepping back into the world of classical Athens, stepping into kind of this like created nostalgic space. And of course, Lucian does it. He's a little bit more wry about it, a little bit more pointed than Alciphron is, but it's the same kind of process. And they're part of the same kind of literary trend that's happening. So please read more Lucian, because you're all going to love it. There's like, this is for everyone listening. Please read more Lucian. You're never going to be sad about it. It's amazing. But so the dialogues of the courtesans too, or that's what they're called, right? Dialogues of the Hetarae. I love them too. It's the same reason I love Greek tragedy. It's because you have, again, it's not the actual voices of women, but it's someone like representing the voice of a woman, right? And you're trying to like incorporate, just as a good playwright or a good fictional letter writer, you're actually going to have to tap into some kind of empathy for their position in society to write it in a compelling and effective way. So I'm just in love with anything like that purports to give the voice of a woman or give voice to a woman, even if it's written by a man.
I mean, we have to take what we can get, right? I mean, it's why I love Euripides so much, because to me, he's the one who actually wanted to know what women thought. And he was like, I'm going to actually examine them as real people. And like, you know, the other two players they write great women. Don't get me wrong. But like Euripides was clearly fascinated by them in a totally different way, at least in terms of what survives. Like,
yes,
it's the best.
Well, I am here to tell you also, what does not survive does the same thing, or at least the bits that we have that do survive. Yes, the fragments. Yeah. Well, and that's the thing is with these women, again, I think it comes down to, you have this really constricted society for women, and the ideal for women is very, again, constricted. They don't have a lot of options. A path is very clearly laid out for them, ideally. But there are women who are not always following that path because of just life, right? Life is complicated, and ideals and realities are always different things. And so you have women like, you have characters like Medea, right? That someone like Euripides is going to write about and find super compelling. And then you have women like Phryne who in a way become characters because of the way their stories are recorded and told. But they're just so compelling to people, even in their own time, because they're not following that idealized path that's been offered to women. And it's sort of like, maybe you're offended by their presence in public, but you're also compelled. You're also super compelled. And you know, again, like finding a character like Medea you don't have to agree with her choices to find her a really compelling character and a really well-written character. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, especially when you're talking Athens in that general time period. Like,
yes.
Yeah, I mean, you're going to take what you can get, especially, or just like anything, that presents these women as not only like real and kind of complex characters, which is what I see in Medea and why I love her so much, but like just, the difference, like you're saying, like people who were just different than what Athenian or women in Athens were kind of required to be. I mean, imagine how fascinating that would be. You might be like, I think whatever you're doing is horrifying and like against the gods, but it's still interesting. It's still
but I can't look away from it.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think for women like Phryne, and the other like prominent Hetairai, and I think you really see this when you get to like the comedies and they're making fun of the women so much. And by name, they're like, Phryne's like a Charybdis. She swallows down a ship captain with the ship too, right? Like really, some pretty nasty things. Or they're like,
who says that?
A playwright, Timocles says that.
Wow, that's something else.
He has a sort of a lyric passage in one of his comedies, and he's naming all of the different famous Hetairai, and comparing them to monsters like Scylla and Charybdis. It's a real moment really when he does that. But yeah, like, even if I think you're terrible and greedy and you're getting all these, men's money, I'm going to keep paying attention to what you're doing, But again, I think that's also a way to kind of navigate the complexities of a society that does not offer any other options to women, or many options to women. And they're trying to figure out how they feel about this. I always think of, like, you can imagine like Phryne back in the day, kind of like, is it Regina George from Mean Girls being like, why are you so obsessed with me?
Yeah.
Comic playwrights, you're always, but of course, like for someone like Phryne, that adds to her notoriety. And so like, if you're the kind of Hetairai that can be named as a punchline, and everyone in Athens is like, oh yeah, that Phryne, we all know about her, that's not a disadvantage to you either. Right.
No.
In terms of, being famous and sought after, your companionship, your sex being sought after. So you're kind of a name brand by that point. And in fact, there's actually one of the anecdotes about Phryne, because of course the Hetairai in anecdotes are famously witty. That this is one of the things they're always kind of getting the better of all these wealthy, notable men they're with. And so this is Phryne when she's older, apparently. And someone says, like, how can you charge that much or whatever? She's like, oh, it's my reputation. Just my reputation is so famous that I can charge full price for the dregs.
Yeah.
So, right, for what's left. She has a lot of good one-liners over time. There's a really good one where a fellow wants to sleep with her, and he says, how much is it? And she says, that'll be basically 100 drachma. And the guy's like, that's you didn't charge the guy yesterday that much. And she's like, yeah, but I actually wanted to sleep with him. So if you hang around till I want to, you can get a deal too. But basically, they're always sort of offering these little sort of funny little punchlines, always getting the best of the men that are around them. So
yeah, I mean, it's refreshing. Like, obviously, you know, we're talking about the very horrifying nature of their lives. Otherwise, like, it wasn't, you know, obviously all good, but like, it is so nice to still have that kind of lightness attached to it. And just imagine that, you know, hopefully some were able to find that kind of lightness, or to like enjoy aspects of their life and work. And like, yeah, I mean, I hope that's often true, that they were able
again,
to,
like finding the power that was available to them in these situations, right? It's not, you know, again, I'm not going to say that she was fully free to do whatever, but she can navigate the world in a way that isn't available to an Athenian wife. And she can say things to men that a typical Athenian wife or daughter or whatever can't say. So she, you know, again, so these are all anecdotes, and it becomes kind of like a standard of the genre of anecdotes about Hetairai that they are witty. So whether they were actually witty in real life is a different thing, but one can imagine there were probably some pretty good opportunities for them to be witty, right? Like, again, it's this, it allows us to create a space in which we can speculate about what their lives might have been, the possibilities that could have been there for a woman like that. And I mean, this is one of them. And I, you know, as a woman who likes a good singer herself, I love the idea of them just sort of unloading on these really wealthy, powerful men.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and I mean, if it becomes that much of kind of like a trope about them, you got to think that there was definitely some accuracy in there, whatever level it got, you know, expanded upon, but like, it came from somewhere, the idea that they are witty. And like, what a great opportunity. I mean, the guys are going to pay you for sex. You might as well have some fun with it.
Exactly. Exactly. And the other thing that you see in that one anecdote where she's like, "Well, wait around and see if I want to sleep with you," is that you see like a little bit of what I would consider a kind of sexual agency that's available to her as a sex worker of a certain status, not available to all, but like that she's kind of making use of that, the agency that's available to her. And that's, again, we were talking about tragic heroines earlier. That's why I love tragic heroines. They're in these really constricted circumstances, but they're reaching for that agency that they can find, and they're making use of it. Sometimes in horrible ways, but they're,
sometimes you kill your kids, but it's your own decision. Sorry, I always have to bring back to and make light of that. Is it good? Probably not, but I do it all the time.
Medea would be laughing too, I'm sure.
Exactly. She gets me.
Yeah. Yeah. But I also think with Phryne, like, there's this idea too that she, like, even she starts to get fun of in certain ways too. So I was saying earlier, the Hetarae and the philosophers are often connected. And there's a famous story about her and this fellow Xenocrates. He's like the head of the academy. He's like a really conservative, old, crusty philosopher. And she's like, that's it. She bets some people. She's like, I'm going to go seduce him. And so she shows up at his house and she's like, "Oh, some people are chasing me. You have to let me in and I've got to stay here overnight." And he's like, "Okay, come on in." And he only has one couch, right? Or like a bed couch. In the ancient world, they're kind of the same thing. And so they have to lie there together. And she's like doing her best to kind of be sexy Phryne, and nothing happens. And she loses the bet because he cannot be swayed, right? He's a man of the mind. Even the most beautiful sex worker cannot do a thing for him. And she comes out, but of course, because she's really witty, she's like, "We made the bet about a man, not a statue." So she can be gotten the best of too, but she's still sort of, at least again in the anecdotes, she's always still kind of on top of things, which is one thing I really love about the stories about her.
Yeah. I mean, okay, how many more anecdotes are there? Can you share more?
Goodness. I'm trying to think of like which ones there are, which would be so those are kind of the key ones, right? Like this is the thing. And the thing that I reflect on with a woman like Phryne is, you feel, and this is how it works with a woman like Aspasia, a woman like Phryne, you feel like you know her whole story just as well as like Pericles' story or Alcibiades. But then you're like, oh yes, someone wrote Plutarch, of course, wrote a whole biography of him. There's like a whole narrative of most of those really noted men. And with Phryne, it's like, here's an anecdote here, here's an anecdote there. That's all we've got. But because of the way that these sort of fragmentary stories work, our brains are kind of putting them all together, creating a narrative. And it's only when you look closely that you're like, oh, I don't know much about her birth. I know nothing about her death. The only story we have is that one I just told you, where she's like, I'm selling the dregs, right?
Right.
That's all we know. We don't know what happened to her in the end, finally. But we have kind of created a fulsome image from these fragments on our own. And just like we were talking about earlier, she's the most famously beautiful woman in 4th century Athens. What does she look like? The only thing we know is that she's pale-skinned. Right. We know nothing else.
And I think a lot too lately about what pale skinned might have meant to the Greeks too, because I think there's a level of, of course there's a level of like whiteness that is like put upon ancient Greece now, right? To like westernize it and make it this like origin of quote unquote Western civilization. And I forget how this came up. It was like on Twitter recently. But like, if we're talking about somebody because whatever the context was, it was like in Anatolia in Turkey. Like, what does pale skinned mean there? Like, it doesn't necessarily mean what we think of as pale skinned. Like, it's pale in context to what they know. And so, I just think that's so interesting to think about too.
Well, and a lot of the sort of modern interpretations of her, especially in painting from like the 19th century, is referencing also the statue, the Aphrodite of Cnidos, or just statues sort of in general, which at that point, right, this is like after the 18th century, art historians have really thought about the white marble, and they want it to be the white marble, ignoring all the painting and other gilding and things that were actually on ancient statues. And so the painters are depicting her often as being like marble white. So she basically looks like a statue in the paintings. There's a really famous painting of her on trial before the Areopagus by a painter named Jerome. And in that one, her skin is white as white can be, right? Like whiter than marble. And so when people depict her, and again, these are more modern depictions, but there's another painter, Boulanger, who has a painting of her kind of reclining on a bed. And his model, I think, was Italian. But they're using like a lot of, at that time, what are considered like Italian models, Jewish models, who are considered to be exotic at that time. Right. And so so when, he exhibits this at the Academy and people look at this painting, they're like, oh, that's not what we think Phryne should look like. Right. That's, oh my goodness. And one of them calls her fat, and she is just distinctly not fat. They love to do this, right? There's another painter, a Polish painter later, who paints her, and they say she looks like a man, one of the critics. It's like, so the thing about, Phryne is that in the stories, in the ancient stories, she can be whatever you want her to be. Whatever you think is beautiful, whatever you think is pale, whatever, you can project because she's a fragment. And then I think that's also what makes her compelling, is that because she is fragmentary, that you can do whatever you want. You can fill in the blanks however you want. That is the most pleasurable and satisfying to you. So she becomes, and I think that's something that's common with the way we tell stories about women, prominent women, even in 2023, right? That these sort of fragmentary narratives where we don't really allow ourselves to know them deeply and meaningfully gives us a certain kind of power over them to mold them into whatever we want them to be. And if someone presents to you a version of her or of a woman like Phryne that isn't what you thought and what you expected and what you took pleasure from, then people tend to get really defensive and angry about it too. I mean, at least these art critics, the different images of her. But so the thing about Phryne is like we don't know enough of these details to really know her. But that, I think, is another source of what has made her compelling over time.
I mean, it sounds like so much of the ancient world with just the fragmentary nature of it all, right? And like that's so much more interesting than if we knew everything, like just the big open questions.
Oh, yeah. And I really think, with fragments, it allows us to think in different ways about things, to kind of, we can hyper focus on some details because that's all that we have, right? Or we can be more imaginative, and sometimes that speculation can be really generative. It can take us out of the assumptions that we've made about the ancient world as well. Yeah, I mean, obviously I love fragments. I wrote a whole dissertation about them, but it's, to me, those are some of the most compelling parts of the ancient world. And they're also, when we look closely at them, they're often the ones that contradict the dominant narratives that we have about the ancient world. Yeah.
I want to learn everything all the time. This also made me think of Helen of Troy, or of Sparta, rather. But like, obviously mythologically different, and she's not as fragmentary. But at the same time, this notion of like the most beautiful person in the world, whatever that might mean. But then specifically the ways that she has been made into so many different things, and like whitened to such a degree. It's always so interesting. Like I realize this is going to come up in a couple conversations now because it's recently done, but I spoke with Ruby Blondell, who's just written a book called Helen of Troy in Hollywood. Yes. Well, we talked all about this. But like specifically, of course, because this was in reference to Hollywood, but like the things that Helen has become. It was just absolutely fascinating conversation, but it just made me think of all of this because it sounds like the same kind of thing, which is this notion of beauty. Yeah.
I am so glad you brought that up. I'm so glad you thought of Helen, because I have a theory that I don't really explore in this book, but I will in an article at some point, I think, that she is like a human 4th century real life Helen because of that.
It certainly sounds like that. Yeah.
Yeah. And part of the reason, the connection that I think is actually in the trial, right? When she, is revealed and everyone's sort of like gawking at her and their reactions are not under their own control anymore, is that's sort of Helen whenever you see her depicted. Because Helen, on Vaugh's paintings, it's, they're kind of generic in a sense. I apologize to art historians. But often depictions of Helen, like she's not depicted as being too terribly different than other women or goddesses around her, but it's how people are responding to her that tells you that she's beautiful. So we don't need to know Phryne looked like this. Her nose was shaped like this. Her breasts look like this to know that everyone in that trial was shocked by her beauty. That's what tells us that she's the most beautiful. So she's like Helen in that way, but there's actually even more of a connection. I think, so I don't think that happened. I think she was probably really on trial. There's a comic play that's a few decades after the trial would have been that mentions it, but doesn't mention her being revealed to everyone. It talks about her going around and supplicating the jury, right? Going to them and saying, please, don't put me to death or whatever. Yeah. So I think that idea of her revealing herself is actually connected to stories of Helen. And that we see in tragedy in particular, because famously when Menelaus, when they're sacking Troy and they find Helen, what does Menelaus want to do to Helen? He wants to kill her. And what does she do?
Yes.
She
just gets naked.
Yeah. She's like, check it out. Yeah. Look how gorgeous I am. And he's like, well, okay, let's go live happily ever after then, sweetheart. And this is famously what women do when they are beseeching someone. It's not always sexual. Like Hecuba does it in the Iliad to Hector, right? She reveals her breast. She's like, this is where you nursed as a baby. Don't go into battle. Clytemnestra does it to Orestes, but Orestes is like, I don't care. You murderous, horrible woman, right? It doesn't, and it also doesn't work because he has a nurse, right? Like she didn't really nurse him. And the nurse is a character in that play. But so I think that this is a reference to all these scenes that are mostly referenced in tragedy, but have this epic history. And there is a fragment, speaking of fragments, of a poem by a lyric poet named Stesichorus, where the Greeks encounter Helen and they're angry at her. And it's almost like a courtroom. It's sort of pseudo judicial. And they would like to, but by looking at her beauty, they effectively acquit her, so to speak. They don't attack Helen. She survives. And so I think, the people who are writing these stories, they know every detail of the history of Greek literature, especially epic, especially tragedy. And I think they're like, this is it. This is what is happening. So I think she's another Helen for many reasons. But I think in this scene, they're like, she's just like Helen. And that connection is explicit. Yeah. Yeah.
That's wonderful.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, this is going to work out really well because I'm pretty sure this episode's going to air like right after my Helen of Troy and Hollywood one.
Oh, awesome. Oh, that's hilarious that right after Ruby. I was just visiting Ruby in Seattle last month too, and we had long conversations about this. So I'm super excited about this. Yeah, this is wonderful.
Oh, that's so great. Well, they were so fun to talk to. So
Ruby is. I have said this to Ruby before. There's like the Rubiness of Ruby cannot be like it is so essential to Ruby as a person, right? To them as a person. But
it's so funny. And I didn't even I heard the name before, I think because when I'd written about Helen. But actually Ruby's publicist came to me and was just like, here's this book. And I was like, hell yeah.
Yeah. No, it's cool because Ruby's work on Helen and like the reception of Helen kind of for me was a way for me to think about, Phryne and how she became a cultural phenomenon again in the 19th century, particularly in France, where she has this amazing afterlife and the parallels with whatever we think really or would have happened with a figure like Phryne in the 4th century are so intense. Like as I was doing this research, every single detail that came up was too perfect almost. So she experiences this renaissance with painting. There's the Neo-Grec movement of these academic painters, and they're painting like scenes from antiquity of anything in great detail, right? And so Jerome paints this famous painting of Phryne in the moment of her revelation in front of the Areopagus. And it's quite a painting. Again, it's exceptionally detailed. Phryne herself is standing on top of a little podium. and she's nude, but she's sort of from behind and she's turned her head to the side. So you can't see like her, you can't see those amazing breasts. You can't see really her face in great detail. So again, you can do this process of like, of shaping her in whatever way you find attractive. She looks like a statue. The pose is copying the Aphrodite and Anadyomene of Apelles, like the coming out of the sea with your hand on either side of your head. Again, I'm acting this all out on a podcast. But
I mean, the thing is, I can picture it just even before you act it out, but just like, all of it. So, and also this will be posted with a promo, and my lovely Michaela can pull out all those images, and then people will know exactly what you're doing.
I can help you with that. Yeah. I mean, these are the kind of images that have saturated our culture so much that even if you don't know who Botticelli is, even if you don't even know who Aphrodite is, you're like, oh, I've seen lots of pictures of art of naked ladies posed in a certain way. And that's all coming from these ancient images. So this painting, it makes such a splash, right? And people are so compelled. They love it. They get little tiny statues of Phryne in this pose to put in their houses. She gets used in advertising, like advertising cigarettes and stuff. People are so into it. But there's a model behind this, right? So this is when people are starting to use nude models. So we have that sort of resonance with the story of Phryne and Praxiteles. So there's an actual nude model. She's actually the inspiration for one of the characters in La Boheme, for Mimi in La Boheme. Like, and again, even if you don't know La Boheme, you know Rent. Right? All of these things have just like, it's like dropping a pebble in a still pond and it just ripples and ripples and ripples. So Phryne's cultural resonances are just everywhere. But basically, this is the same time as the French artists, the academic sort of snooty patooty artists are using these models. The models are also a lot of the same women who are also appearing on stage in these spectacles at places like the Moulin Rouge that are like, they're showing nude women, or if they're not showing nude women, they're showing nearly nude women. Right. And so there's this great interest in sort of late 19th century Paris in naked ladies and how to get them on stage, plus the story of Phryne, who is famously naked. So the great thing about the story of Phryne is that you are telling a story from ancient Greece. So you have that cultural cachet, and it's a way for you to get a naked or nearly naked lady on stage. And so there are operas, there are performances at the Folies Bergère where the actress she strips down in sort of the final scene, but she's wearing a flesh tone bodysuit and she's backlit, right? So again, you're not seeing the details, but your brain is filling them all in. And she becomes this really famous cultural touchstone in 19th century Paris again, and is like a household name basically, yet again. And all of the real women, so just like Phryne is the real woman behind possibly the statue, at least the stories, all of the real women have these really compelling public stories, and they're women who are sometimes associated with sex work. One of them has an affair. One of the women who plays Phryne has an affair with the King of Belgium, right? So there's this sort of prurient interest in their sex lives and an association of these nude models with sex work. And so all of the themes that are present in the 4th century and then in the other ancient stories told over the subsequent centuries pop up all together again in 19th century France. It blew my mind. Every one of these details, every one of these women is like a really compelling woman, but again, about whom we have fragmentary stories. Or we have echoes, right, of these different models, and they pop up in stories like La Boheme. So there's echoes of them, but we don't have their story. And it's very similar to a woman like Phryne, where we just don't have a fulsome biography, but we're putting it all together from these fragmentary anecdotes. So it's absolutely fascinating how she has this resurgence again, in the 19th century. So.
Yeah, I feel like I didn't know enough about Phryne anyway, but I certainly had no idea of this. I always think about that kind of thing as like being so purely mythological rather than somebody like her, I feel like that's I guess if she was quite so, famous in the ancient world too, like it makes sense. And certainly if there are these statues of her at Delphi and Thespiae, but like, it's wonderful.
Yeah,
it's so much more exciting than mythology, which is funny for me to say, but it's so much better.
Well, it's a kind of mythology, right?
Yeah.
So it's mythology that has the kernel of a real person at its
Yeah, true.
center. But it really
Yeah.
it speaks to, in the same way that studying mythology does, right? It speaks to, what do people find compelling about human stories? People are always and forever going to find a sexy lady, right? A hot woman is always going to be compelling, no matter what you think is hot, right? Like the idea of a hot woman will always be a story people want to tell. And so I've been thinking about this so much every time I think of like women, famous women in the public eye, right? And I think of like the stories of Marilyn Monroe operate in a similar way, right? Her story, the way we've broken it down into these little fragmentary bits, and we put so much onto her, right? So it's like Helen. It starts with Helen, but then there's Phryne, and then there's Marilyn Monroe, and then there's all these different figures that we will always and always find compelling.
Yeah. It's all so fascinating. Now I can't stop thinking about how also, like, just to bring it back to Helen too, that like and this is true for like most of Greek mythology, but like, she's not described either. You can also put on to her whatever type of beauty you find beautiful, whatever type of person you find attractive. And it's so, it's so interesting to have that. And I think it is just sort of a mythology thing because of the way these stories are told. The intention was not to describe like we would today in prose, but like still it makes this real. It's just so different in these contexts where it is about, the quote unquote most beautiful people, because it really does mean like whatever you want it to mean.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I think all of these like art critics were having such a strong reaction, because they're like, no, I wanted it to be this. And this is what I think is attractive and beautiful. And then you presented me with a different option, which is equally valid, but it's not the option that I am attached to. And there's also like a fundamental, I think, identification with what you find attractive, what you find compelling, that when someone says, well, maybe it's something else, you have this really strong visceral reaction, the strong no to it.
Yeah. I mean, it's so funny too, especially in those kind of contexts, because like everything is going to be ultimately based on the culture that existed around the creator. And so it's like, you can be mad that Phryne isn't what you like want her to be, but regardless, the person creating her is creating her in, what would you say, 19th century France? Like, so she's going to be based on that more than she's going to be based on the Phryne of the ancient world anyway. Like, all of it is just completely subjective, and that's what makes it interesting.
Well, exactly. And I think, and that's so true, like with Phryne, because almost in her own lifetime, there start to be versions of her. So even when people have a Phryne, like the real Phryne to compare to, right? Then she's like I said, a punchline in these comic plays, or, she's sort of, she already is the subject of anecdote in her own lifetime. And so sort of Phryne, the real woman, and Phryne, the woman of fragments, the stories, right? They are diverging in her own lifetime already. And I mean, that's also something to think about when we think about fame and reputation and all the rest, right? Like how that happens, but it happens in a very specific way to women as well. And the things that we focus on for the anecdotes that we circulate, for the stories that we like to tell, for what we find compelling, right? And so in the case of Phryne, just shows us, right? We want to know a bit about her sex life. We want to think about how hot she is. We want to think about her without her clothes on, right? All of those things show us that there are very specific things that happen to women in the public eye that don't necessarily happen to men, right? Like I've thought about this a lot, and thought about, are there other men who undergo kind of a similar process, right? The only one I can think of is maybe like Alcibiades, because we love to tell stories about how he was sort of a young hottie and how he dressed in public and how he presented himself. But we have those stories, but they combine with, again, that more fulsome biography. We know what family he's from,
Yeah, we know things about him, but even just the way you're saying that and using him as an example, I think it's really telling, because the stuff that we think about him is often like dramatic and salacious in similar ways to women's stories.
Yeah, it's kind of female coded in a way, right?
Exactly. That's exactly the right description. Like he's not all the sort of, the salacious details are not because he's this big masculine manly man. Like it's coded towards more feminine aspects.
Yeah.
Wild stuff too, like chipping dicks off of Herms, which is the greatest thing in the world. But
do you know what?
Yeah,
do you know it was the faces that got damaged of the Herms. Sorry,
really?
But a fun fact. Yeah, would
that's
think
disappointing.
The most obvious thing to knock off a Herm would be the genitals, right? Because a Herm is, of course, a statue with just a head and genitals on a pillar. But no, they damaged the faces.
Oh, that's disappointing.
I know. When I found that out, I was like, oh, come on, do better. Athenian rascals.
Regardless, Herms are some of my favorite things from the ancient world because they're just so absurd.
I love explaining them. I'm like,
same. I've done it.
This goes at your front door. This is how you protect your property. It's a head and some genitals.
It's just the best. They've just become kind of my thing, and I get so excited when I see them in the wild.
And when you go to Greece and you're looking for the replica statues, they don't have any Herms.
No,
Come
never.
on.
They don't.
Sell a cajillion.
I think. Because
they sell Priapuses.
Because they do, of course. Well, everyone loves the dick, but and certainly the Athenians, but. I think it's just because they're really niche. Well, I think of the Great Dionysia. I've got context.
Yeah.
Dicks on sticks. But I wonder what the general tourism aspect of Greece would actually, if they'd be as interested in Herms as us nerds.
Well, but I bet you they would. Like, they sell the Priapuses, they sell the dirty playing cards, right, with pictures from vases. So I've thought about this a lot while wandering around the souvenir shops of Greece. But if I ever, and partially this is because my auntie would really like one to put in her garden. So,
like a big one, yeah,
she'd like a Herm for her garden, right? So I'm like, if anyone knows how to sculpt one, I'll purchase it.
God, I love Herms so much.
Yeah.
There's one in Epidavros, and I didn't know it was there, and I sort of just walked, and just suddenly it was there, and I don't know how many times I've been quite that excited at a Greek site, and anyway, fucking love Herms.
Surprise! It's a Herm.
It's just they're so.
Rarely are we happy to stumble upon surprise genitals in the wild. So
when they're Herms,
this is hilarious.
Well, I think that sort of everything you've been saying when it comes to Phryne, it's interesting to compare her to and obviously we can't do too much of this because it's already been an hour and 20 minutes, but I just keep thinking of Sappho because she's this other really fragmentary woman. Mm-hmm. But I think I thought of it most when you mentioned how we don't know how anything about Phryne's at the end of her life, or other than that great anecdote about when she's just older. And it's kind of nice because I always think about what Ovid did to Sappho's story, where it's before Ovid, did we think that she killed herself over a man? Because it's the most bummer of an end for someone like Sappho. And it's kind of just nice that, I don't know, Phryne didn't get rewritten in that way, where we just kind of have a question mark instead.
Yeah, where she can just sort of fade off into dignified obscurity rather than, because again, to get into the speculative space, she was famously wealthy. So, I do think, again, if we can sort of say this is a fact, I do think that Phryne existed. She was on trial. Again, it probably didn't end that way, but I do think she was prominent and probably quite wealthy because she very famously, again, this isn't an anecdote, but she offered to rebuild the walls of Thebes after Alexander the Great destroyed them. Oh now, again, because Phryne's super witty and super smart, it's not as simple as she's just I'm going to show off how wealthy I am. Thebes, of course, is not that far from Thespiae, her hometown. Yeah. And Thebes is it's the bigger, more prominent city in Boeotia. So it had torn down the walls of Thespiae and in fact sacked Thespiae in revenge because they had associated themselves against the Thebans, basically. They had allied themselves against the Thebans. So it's also her saying F you, if you want walls, you got to come to a thespian to get them. Right.
Yeah.
But again, so we know that she was super wealthy at some point. So I do like to imagine, again, if I'm speculating in the most hopeful speculation, she's living not a bad end of her life because she can afford to, right? Mm-hmm. do whatever she can exercise some of that agency. And so that's sort of like the hopeful way to speculate about the end of her life/career. But it is interesting, again, she's a very beautiful woman. So often we don't want to sort of speculate on like what happens to aging women's bodies, right?
True.
So the dregs, right? Notice it's this really sort of elusive comment. It's, we're not talking about, Phryne looked this way and then this is what happened to her. Because again, for that sort of pleasurable speculation on the beauty of someone, you don't want the details because the details are going to sort of ruin the image, actually. But yeah, I do sort of hopefully speculate that she sort of lived an okay end of her life.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's badass that you can be like, I can rebuild the walls of Troy, or not Troy, of Thebes. Like,
she probably could have done that.
I mean, that would have been cool too.
Yeah.
I'm connecting it to the other most beautiful. But yeah, I mean, that's wonderful, especially at the Thespiae connection, which also reminded me, and I know you said it's fairly certain that she was from Thespiae, but when you first explained it and made the Eros connections and stuff, all I could think was also the rumor of Sappho being married to the guy Kerkylos of Andros, where it's like, it's literally just like man from man or whatever it was. It's exactly. I know like on Wikipedia they say like Dick from Man Island or whatever.
Well, I mean,
get something like that.
Dick from Man Island. Well, no, like I do think sometimes you're like, okay, that detail is right on the nose. It's too on the nose. But then when I started looking into the 19th century receptions of Phryne, and I was like, oh my goodness, no, because these are not things anyone could have control over, these details. So and they're just a bit too perfect. So it is possible to me that some of those things are connected actually, right? And that it's not just a perfect literary connection, but it's just enough.
It sounds more real than Sappho's too. Like it's not the same. It's more just like, that's a lovely coincidence, this idea that she's from a place with such like connections to Eros. Like that's just it's a good coincidence versus being too on the nose.
Exactly. But I think Sappho's a great comparison too, though, because she's this woman that we have fragmentary knowledge of, and we all write little narratives about her that sort of suit our needs at any given time. And it's, when people have thought about Sappho's sexuality over time, all of that has changed as people have thought sort of more broadly and differently about sexuality. All of these things change. So there will be more Phrynes, more versions of her, right, that are over time that suit the needs of any given time, right? If I were to sit down and make a film about her now, right, it would be very different to the ones that were made about her in the 50s, but it would suit my tastes and this time and all of those things. And it's been true, again, like that happened already in Phryne's own lifetime, and then started immediately to happen when we think about how her stories were recorded and passed down, immediately in Alexandria. The Alexandrian scholars and comic authors who became obsessed with classical Athens, they did different things with the character of Phryne or the stories about Phryne. And then you get to the Roman imperial authors, they're doing something even different. So there's always going to be more Sapphos, more Helens, more Phrynes, depending on what the audience and the artist wants and needs.
I'm just glad we have some ladies from the ancient world.
I mean, really, it is. I always say, like, when people are like, okay, if you could have anything from the ancient world, any text, and I'm like, okay, yes, I would like a full copy of some of the fragmentary plays of Euripides, but really, I just would like a letter from one of these women, one letter. To a friend, like you were saying earlier, like to a peer, right? Just talking about like what I did this morning, what my day looked like, how I felt about this famous thing that happened. If I could have just one of those, or if I had a time machine, right? Who would I talk to?
Oh my God. That question is so unanswerable. But I mean, it would just be literally like, I just want to know what women thought. For themselves without the influence of men. It seems so simple, and yet it is so impossible to know based on what we have.
Well, I'd be like, Phryne, tell me what you really thought about some of your clientele, right?
Yes.
What were your feelings about these people, these men that you were associated with? And honestly too, even though I've been saying like the whole thing about Phryne is that we don't know what she looked like, I would love to know what she looked like. I would love to see what was thought to be beautiful, how she groomed herself, right? Like all of that. I would just love to see what was her morning routine like, what kind of skincare situation did she have going on, all the rest of that.
Well, yeah, I mean, besides the fact that it would be lovely to know about like one specific person, it would also just be so insightful. It would just be so insightful into that time period and women and beauty and like literally everything from what one person looked like in a way that I think there's not a lot. Like you could find any other woman and you'd get some kind of insight. But yeah, somebody who is so explicitly described that way, knowing what she looked like would be so insightful.
I mean, and secretly I would love it if she was imperfect too, right? Because this idea that like her body is so powerfully beautiful, right? And they don't, there are no words like perfect. And this idea of like a perfect beauty doesn't really seem to exist in the way it does now, where there's the idea that you can if you just put on the right filters on your Instagram, get the right face, do the right, plastic surgery. It's sort of like, no, she's a compelling beauty. It doesn't mean that she doesn't have a bump in her nose or, something that we might interpret as a flaw, which I think is also something I find kind of enjoyable speculation too about her.
Yeah. I mean, I think again, mythologically, because I always think in myth, but like the same goes for Helen. Like what did they think of when they thought of beauty back then? And just what did that mean? And oh my God.
Yeah. Like, so we know how they showed it, how they communicated it. But what did it actually mean is a whole different thing. Yeah. Like Ruby always says with Helen, like part of the way she's the most beautiful is because she has the best accessories. Right? It's not what she actually looks like, but it's her jewelry, right, that shows this. Or like same thing with Aphrodite when she's getting dressed up to go seduce someone, she's putting on her special accessories. So it's just Phryne doesn't have any because she's naked. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. It's so funny you say that because Ruby absolutely said that in our episode. It's just all about accessories.
I appreciate that. That's amazing.
Oh my gosh. Okay, well, I mean, this has been so much fun. I just love so much when there's women we can talk about. So thank you so much.
Oh, I'm so happy. Well, let me tell you, if I do the second research project that I'm thinking of doing on Lys, who is one of Phryne's colleagues, and also like possibly, famously the most beautiful woman of the 4th century, I might have another woman to talk about. We'll just see if there's enough there. I'm just concerned there might not be enough. But
that's fair.
Yeah.
I mean, story
Once
of
I
my
put it
podcast
together.
Oh, please tell me immediately.
Well, generative speculation, right?
Yeah. Oh, it's just the best. Well, why don't you say a little bit more about the book itself? I'm not sure. I don't know the details at all. I just remember you saying you had one. So
yeah. Well, it is coming out in February 2024. It's called Phryne, A Life in Fragments. So there you go. And it really is sort of focusing on what it means to tell the story of a woman's life when you do not have a fulsome biography of her. So I talk about the trial. I talk about her relationship with artists. I do a bit of that speculation based on, in particular, legal cases that focus on sex workers, a little bit of speculation about what her early life could have been like and sort of how she might have moved around Athens. And then I have a really fun chapter on all of those 19th century sexy stage spectacles in Paris, and a couple of the movies, like the Peplum movies from the 50s, starring like Miss Grease is one of the actresses who plays her. And of course, very famously, Gina Lollobrigida plays a version of Phryne in a very famous film that launched her career. And it it replicates the courtroom scene. So all of that is covered in the final chapter of this book. But I have to say, it was a really fun project to work on because, as we mentioned earlier, it was like, fun fact. Did you know that Gina Lollobrigida played a version of Phryne and it launched her career, right? Like all these little neat details. And again, that are so perfect for thinking about the ways that we think of women in the public eye. It's been so helpful and clarifying for me to kind of put all these things together, all these various narratives about one woman and to think about how they were compiled and passed on. And again, how the story of this woman's life in her own lifetime started to take on its own life has just been a really fascinating and really fun process.
I bet. I mean,
and there's lots of pretty pictures too.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Well, just having any woman like just having this kind of content about any woman from the ancient world really is just so refreshing and lovely. And like I can only imagine how much fun it would be, because it's just so insightful in a way that we're just lacking in so much otherwise, that you've just got to like take hold of what we've got. Oh, well, it sounds wonderful. Selfishly, I'm really excited that it comes out in time for me to use it as a source for Women's Month episodes next year.
Oh, excellent. Excellent. Well, if you need anything, I can always send you proofs. So
I will be fine with that. Thank you so much. We didn't even talk about peopling the past. Do you want to do like a quick plug?
Sure. All right. Yes. Okay. So I am also the co-host of a podcast called Peopling the Past, and it's part of a larger public humanities project. We have blog posts and we have videos. So if you are interested in untangling the threads of the real lives of real people in the past, that's what we focus on. We have a podcast. We actually have a whole season on women in the ancient world. So if you found the tidbits of what we talked about with Phryne here compelling, we have even more detailed conversations about real women in the ancient world. And you can find it at peoplingthepast.com. And sometimes Liv collaborates with us too. So so you can even find a little bit of crossover material and more to come on that topic anyways.
Oh yeah. And just generally everyone with People in the Past is lovely. And you guys got me into the first ever academic thing that I've done, which was really exciting.
So Liv's like a real life academic as well. Yeah.
I mean, my BA has gotten me really far. That's great.
Hey, public scholarship is for everyone.
I mean, I've learned that more and more as I've been doing this for so many years. It's the best.
It is. It really is.
Yeah. Well, I'll add in areas where we can, where people can find, more about people in the past and everything and follow things. Yeah. But is there anything else that you want to share before we close off?
I think that's all I can think of right now.
Yeah, great. I know it's always being put on the spot when I ask that.
Well, no, I'm like, what else is going on? I'm going to go home tonight. I'll be like, there's 68 other things I would like to have mentioned.
Oh, but I know, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we got an hour and a half in here, so we're great. Okay. But yeah, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. It was so much fun.
Oh, thank you for having me. And I think as we discovered in Vancouver this spring, we can probably talk on end forever about fascinating things. So
yeah, I hope this is not the first time or the last time you're on my show, rather.
Well, wait till I read the next book. We'll just see what comes up.
Perfect. Nerds, thank you for listening, as always. Sometimes I do love like a clickbaity episode title, Like, did she flash her way to freedom? I mean, maybe. But it's definitely not the most interesting thing about her, even if it could be true. But gods, does it make for a catchy title? I mean, hell yes. I didn't know any of the rest about Phryne, and I'm so thrilled to have learned it all. Like, she was so much more interesting than just like the woman who is said to have flashed a courtroom. So huge thank you to Melissa for coming on the show. I'm so excited to be sharing this one with you all. This came up because, like, at the colloquium that I mentioned, Melissa said in passing that if I ever wanted to do an episode about Phryne, she was writing a book. And I was like, like, yes. All I knew was the meme, but, like, I did know that there had to be so much more that I wanted to learn, not least because, like, there had to be enough for a book. It's my favorite thing when I get conversations pitched to me this way, like, hey, if you ever want to know about X, let me know. That's what people will just say. And then X is always like the most excitingly nerdy thing I've ever heard of. Speaking of, you can read and hear more about fascinatingly nerdy things about the ancient people through Peopling the Past. They've got a podcast, but also a blog of incredible information and like guest writers and stuff. It's amazing. I have linked to their site in the episode's description. Thank you all for listening. You are so cool. This is so fun. My job is awesome, and thanks. And it's all thanks to you all. Let's Talk About Myths, Baby is written and produced by me, Liv Albert. Michaela Smith is the Hermes to my Olympians, the assistant producer. The podcast is hosted and monetized by iHeartMedia. Listen on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Help me continue bringing you the world of Greek mythology and the ancient Mediterranean by becoming a patron, where you'll get bonus episodes and more. Visit patreon.com/. mythsbaby, or click the link in this episode's description. I am Liv, and I love this shit, like particularly when smart people come on and tell me all about very real women doing very cool things. It's the best.